Failover. The firewall can run in a failover configuration. You do that by setting up two devices, and you do it for hardware redundancy. And when you run failover, you can only run active passive. That means that you have two firewalls, and one of the firewalls are always the active firewall. And as soon as something happens with the active firewall, the secondary firewall will take over the role of the active firewall. So there is no load sharing in a failover situation. There's always one firewall that does not handle any traffic, and all traffic goes through the other one. And they swap roles when something happens. There are a few requirements for failover. They need to be the same model, and they must run the same software versions. Also, they need to have the same number of interfaces in the two boxes, so you should have two identical boxes. You connect them in parallel to each other. That means that if your firewall is connected to 4 different subnets, and you get a second firewall for a failover situation, the second firewall does also need to be connected to all 4 subnets. This is really important. So they work in parallel, and they are connected parallel to each other. And on each interface, you have one IP address, like you always have, and you have one standby IP address. So on the interface configuration, you add a secondary IP address that is for standby reasons. And that secondary IP address is only being used by the passive device. So for routing purposes, you only need to care about one IP address per interface, like .1, but you also need to configure a second IP address on each subnet, like .2, but you never use that for anything. And if there is a failover situation when they swap roles because of hardware problems, the IP addresses 1 and 2 will swap boxes, and that will be done automatically. The firewalls also needs to be connected with one extra interface. Most commonly is a crossover cable, an Ethernet cable between the two firewalls that is only being used for synchronization. That interface is used to synchronize all configuration changes and all states, all TCP sessions that is currently running in the firewall, all VPN sessions and everything, so that when there is a hardware problem with an active firewall, they can swap roles within less than a second, because the secondary and passive firewall does always have all information needed to run all traffic. The failover is really easy to set up. You configure everything in the primary firewall, and when everything is set up and done, you add the secondary IP addresses, and in the secondary firewall, the passive firewall, you do not configure anything out of the box. It is an empty configuration, and you add 3 or 4 or 5 standby commands for enabling failover. And when you connect it, they will automatically replicate the configuration. And there are really good guides on cisco.com how to do that. The failover is powerful because it's so easy to set up, and it always works. There is almost no flaws at all with the failover in Cisco. The drawback is that it is active-passive. Sometimes Cisco says that failover is active-active, and I would not really agree on that, because failover is active-passive. However, if you run the two firewalls in a failover pair and also run multiple contexts, you can run 2 contexts, and one is active in one device and one is active in the other device. And then you can load share so that they can swap box on hardware problems. However, this is only in a situation where you really need 2 virtual firewalls. If you have only need for one firewall, there is no way for you to load share with failover, because it is always active-passive. However, there is something else than failover that is a new functionality in some newer modules of the firewall, and that's the clustering. Clustering is beyond the scope of this course, but with clustering, you can build a cluster with 2 or even more firewalls, and they will load share traffic between them. And it's only for the largest and most powerful and expensive firewalls. Then you can do a clustering. But failover can be done with any firewall except for the smallest ones and the virtual firewall. And it's quite easy and inexpensive way to set up a hardware redundancy to make sure that your firewall is not a single point of failure. And as I said, it's easy to set up and it always works. And go to cisco.com and search for failover and you will see how easy it is.